They laughed when I told them my pension was gone, laughed like the collapse of my future was the punchline of a cheap joke. I can still hear Rakish's snide voice across the table. The sound of ice clinking in his glass as he said, "Maybe you should have read the fine print." Old man, they didn't know that every mocking grin, every condescending pat on my shoulder was searing itself into my memory. They didn't know that laughter, when aimed at the wrong man, can turn into a curse. Today, they're the weak they once bragged about. Every chibble belonged to me, and yet I bought it with their own arrogance. It started 5 years earlier, before the mockery, and before I learned how betrayal tastes. I was a railway accountant, loyal for 30 years, to the same dull grey office where time itself seemed to rust. Every morning, I'd take my seat near the window that overlooked the tracks, sip my weak tea, and nod politely to the juniors who'd long stopped seeing me as anything more than a relic. 30 years they've said on din mi ma quaiwigs did. Government pension would be my safety net, my final security after all the grey winters. I remember the day it changed. March 7th, 2018. The air smelled of paper and machine oil. My colleague, Kumar, had just returned from the accounts division with a bundle of files. "There's been a delay," he said, half smiling. "Some audit issue. Routine stuff. Routine, what a word." It wasn't routine. A week later, my followings after that. The pension office claimed they couldn't locate the full contribution records. 3 months later, I realized they were never going to find them because they'd been erased. Conveniently, I tried. Everything. Letters, calls, visits to the regional office where clerks gave me pitying looks and murmured, "We'll escalate it." "Sir, escalate where?" "To the same hands that had buried the proof." I knew corruption existed. We all did. But it's a different thing when it bites into your life, when it tears out your peace and leaves you with only bitterness and unpaid bills. I'd saved a small sum, but it wasn't enough. My wife, Sushila, tried to stay calm. "We'll manage," she said, her voice gentle, as always. She was stronger than I deserved. We began cutting corners. No, more new clothes, smaller meals, cheaper medicine, but time was cruel. Her health began to fail, and with no pension money, treatment became a luxury. Then came the day I went to confront Rakish and his brothers. They were local businessmen, real estate dealers with deep pockets and deeper connections. Premier known them for years. We'd grown up in the same town. When I retired, Rakish had even congratulated me. "Now you can finally relax," he'd said with that oily grin. So when I learned that a technical adjustment in my pension records had been processed by a private consultant firm owned by his cousin, I went straight to him. His office smelled of air conditioning and deceit. "Rakish," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "your cousin's firm handled my pension clearance. My records disappeared right after. I just want to know if you can help me trace what happened." He leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink, the ice clinking in rhythm with my rising anger. "Come on, old friend," he said. "You think I have time to look into every lost document? You should have kept your own copies." "I did," I replied. "They were signed off by your cousin's firm." He laughed loudly. "Well, then maybe you should ask him for your pension, or sue the government. Let's see how far that gets you." His brothers joined in, smirking. One of them added, "These old men never learn. They think the world still runs on honesty." That night, I walked home under the weight of that laughter. Something inside me snapped, not like a twig, but like an old bridge giving way under too much weight. I didn't sleep. I sat on the balcony, the sound of dogs barking in the distance, the stars blurring above me. All I could see was frying in bed, erbreating. Shallow, the bottles of medicine we could no longer afford. When she died 2 months later, I didn't cry. The tears had dried long ago. At her funeral, Rakish came, pretending sympathy. "She was a good woman," he said, eyes cold. I looked at him and thought, men like you think you're untouchable because the world's built for your kind. But even mountains fall when the fault line is deep enough. It took me a year to find the fault line. I started by working odd jobs bookkeeping for small merchants, writing applications for people who couldn't. In the process, I began learning the language of land, deeds, encumbrances, auction notices, forfeitures. The same system that had robbed me was a maze. Yes, but every maze has its map. And I was patient. In 2020, When the first wave of dead auctions hit our district, I saw opportunity dressed as tragedy. Land parcels seized from careless owners who'd borrowed too much, believing the market would always rise. Among those names was Rakesh's. He had taken massive loans for a development project that stalled during the pandemic. The bank had begun listing parts of his property for auction. Small lots, but valuable. I remember walking into the auction room, wearing the same faded shirt I'd worn to his office years ago. Nobody noticed me. Why would they? Just another old man among bidders. But I had saved his sold me hours and roosted me. When the hammer fell, I owned my first piece of their land too. Acres of barren soil they'd once mocked as worthless. Over the next 2 years, I kept buying, bit by bit. Rakesh's empire crumbled while I played the silent scavenger. I watched him struggle, his cars vanish, his offices close. He came to me once, desperate. I just need a little liquidity, he said. I'll pay you back double. Liquidity? I smiled. That's what I asked you for once. Remember? His face paled. You can't hold a grudge forever. No, I said quietly. Phew. I can hold land. That was the day I bought his ancestral property, the same estate where he had mocked me years before. When the papers were signed, I stood outside the gates, watching him drive away, his laughter gone. Now, I sit on that land, on the porch where he once sat boasting about profits and power. The wind carries the faint echo of his laughter, but it no longer cuts. It hums like a confession. People say revenge is poison, but sometimes it's medicine bitter, precise, and healing in its own dark way. And as I look out across the fields, I whisper to the ghosts of my past, you laughed at my lost pension. But I sold your land. They said vengeance makes you smaller. That it consumes you from within until you can't tell victory from ruin. Maybe they're right. But standing there, watching Rakesh's name being scraped off the stone gate where it had glinted for decades, I didn't feel smaller. I felt restored. Like some ancient scale had finally tipped back to balance. The estate was a sprawling stretch of mango groves and red earth, the kind of place built on pride and inheritance. The locals called it Shantivan, though there was nothing peaceful about it now. I moved into the small caretaker's quarters at first for walls of cracked plaster and a rusted fan that whined all night. But I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. The soil here was heavy, with the scent of dust and as if it remembered Rejivrit. We done our week. First game. It was our own, Rakesh's youngest. Brother the one who used to mock me the most. He arrived in a white car that still had traces of the old life clinging to it. Tinted windows, loud. Music, a faint smell of expensive cologne that tried to hide desperation. He didn't even greet me. You went too far, Shamaji, he said, stepping out, his eyes burning with indignation. Buying the estate. What are you trying to prove? Nothing, I replied. I'm just trying to live. He laughed, bitter and sharp. Live. You think you can live here? This land is cursed now. Yovev. Made enemies. Then I'll plant thorns, I said, walking past him toward the fields. We grow up here. My father built that house with his own hands. This land, it's in our blood. I turned, meeting his gaze. Then, maybe your father should have taught you what loyalty means. Blood doesn't make you. Righteous, Arun. Actions do. He clenched his jaw, fists trembling. You think you've won. Old man. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said. But regret is lighter than humiliation. He left without another word, the tires spitting dust as he sped away. I stood there until the dust settled, watching the road stretch toward the horizon. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Men. Like the Verma, brothers didn't fade quietly. Their pride wouldn't let them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The estate was too silent. Even the crickets seemed cautious. I walked through the fields with a lantern, the flame dancing in the wind. Every shadow looked like a memory. I thought of Sushila, her laughter, her soft voice telling me to let go of anger. You can't fight darkness with more darkness, she used to say. But she hadn't seen them laugh. She hadn't seen what greed could do to people. A month passed. I hired local laborers to restore parts of the estate. The house, once a symbol of arrogance, began to breathe again under new hands. I made sure the workers were paid on time, something the Vermas never cared to do. Slowly, Whispers began too. Spread through the village. The old man who lost everything is building something again. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, an unfamiliar jeep stopped near the gate. Two men stepped out, one in a crisp white shirt, the other with a police badge glinting on his chest. I recognized the officer, Sub-Inspector Dinesh Yadav, the same man who once turned me away when I tried to file a complaint about my missing pension documents. He smiled, too friendly. Sharmaji, you've been busy, he said, looking around. Yeah. Time, I replied. He nodded, flipping through some papers. We received a complaint. Claims you acquired this property through coercion. I stared at him, my hands tightening around the walking stick. Coercion. I bought it legally. You can check the deeds. He waved his hand lazily. Oh, I'm sure everything looks fine on paper, but there are allegations. Maybe we should discuss it at the station. Behind him, the other man smirked. I didn't need to ask who had sent them. Rakesh still had connections, even in disgrace. I took a deep breath. Inspector, I've spent 30 years writing government records. I know how the system works. If you want to find something, you can. If you want to destroy someone, you can. But I've learned how to play this game. He tilted his head. Are you threatening me, Sharmaji? No, I said softly. I'm warning you. I don't have much left to lose. That makes me a dangerous man to corner. For a moment, he looked uncertain. Then he sighed and handed the papers back. Just doing my job, he muttered, turning away. Went a left extra long time. The sun had vanished, leaving behind streaks of crimson across the sky like a wound, healing badly. I knew this was their first move. They wouldn't stop here. Days turned into weeks. Anonymous men began loitering near the estate. Tools went missing. One night, someone set fire to a corner of the storage shed. I doused it myself before it spread, the smoke burning my throat. I didn't call the police. I knew better. Instead, I visited the district registrar's office the next morning. Old habits die hard, and bureaucracy had always been my battlefield. I spent hours cross-verifying land documents, scanning signatures, tracing ownership lines. That's when I found it a discrepancy. A forgotten clause in Rakesh's mortgage, records that still held his name liable for unpaid dues. If I played it right, I could force a liquidation of his remaining holdings. That evening, as the monsoon clouds gathered over the horizon, I sat by the old veranda, the papers spread before me. The wind howled through the mango trees, and I felt something stir inside me, a strange calm, like the moment before a storm breaks. I whispered into the wind, you wanted war, Rakesh. I'm done surviving. Now I fight, and that was how the real reckoning began, one written not in violence, but in ink, signatures, and silence. And by turning what they thought away, mas maestras who ate na clerk unto our weapon, while they were busy flexing whatever remained of their influence. I moved my pieces quietly, like a chess player who has seen the whole board. The discrepancy in the mortgage records was my opening, a clause that made the lender appetite for foreclosure contingent on a specific schedule of payments that, on paper, had never been amended after a series of loan consolidations. It was the kind of clerical loose end that greedy men assume will never be noticed. Première notice said. First, I visited the bank. The branch manager, Mr. Lockhand, recognized me immediately. An old customer's face is hard to forget in a small town. He greeted me with the mechanical warmth that bureaucrats reserve for the retired. Sharmaji, how can I help you? I need a copy of all transactions against account number 634-8V belonging to Rakesh Verma. Estates from 2017 to present, I said, placing my request like a pebble in still water. He blinked. That's confidential, sir. You'll need proper authorization. I've been authorized by a court in previous matters, I said. I will take the legal route, if necessary. I left the hint dangling. Lawyers listen for such things. Bankers watch the wind. He called his clerk and, 30 minutes and several polite coughs later, slid a stack of photocopies across the counter. I paid him, thanked him, and walked out as if nothing had changed. But each page I read that afternoon tightened a noose around Rakesh. There were payments. Yes, large ones funneled through shell companies with names like Evergreen, Holdings and Pearl Developers. Payments that offset liabilities and reshuffled collateral, always one step ahead of creditors. The clause I'd found, if enforced correctly, could trigger a cross-default on the remaining properties. But banks prefer the soft hum of interest to the noisy business of foreclosure. That's where the law came in. I found a lawyer who still believed in small things. Mira Rao's office was a cramped room above a stationery shop where the smell of ink and paper never left. She was 50, sharp as a trimmed blade, and tired of watching the powerful tilt scales. "You want me to pursue this?" she asked without preamble, scanning the documents I'd brought. "I want you to do what the system is supposed to do," I said. "Hold them to their own papers." She smiled, the kind that acknowledges a rare honesty. "There's risk. They'll throw there. Wait, political pressure, maybe threats. Are you prepared?" I thought of Sushila, of the knights counting coins by candlelight when the power bill was due, not prepared, but obligated. She took the case. We drafted petitions, demanded audits of the loan accounts, and filed a public interest writ that forced the bank to respond. Mira was relentless calling, pushing, writing until bureaucrats stopped pretending paperwork was a joke. The bank, which had once smiled at Rakesh's handwriting, suddenly grew anxious. Their lawyers began to send letters. Their tone was defensive, then conciliatory. Meanwhile, I used another tool: people. The workers I had employed on the estate men, whose hands bore the rounds of hard labor, became a quiet community of allies. I fed them well, paid their families when rains didn't come, and in return they watched the estate like their own homestead. News travels differently in a village. It doesn't ride the internet. It walks from mouth to ear, from chai stall to temple step, and it brings with it a moral currency that papers cannot buy. He stood for us when the Vermes never did. One of them told a neighbor, and that neighbor told another. Until strangers began to bring mango saplings, pottery, even an old tractor someone donated, with a crooked smile. Rakesh reacted like a man surprised his shadow had teeth. Estarte. Using his remaining contacts to slow our hearings, to file petty suits claiming slander and trespass. He sent a woman reputed to be a fixer to the estate with a purse of cash and an offer: return the papers, transfer the property back discreetly, and forget this ever happened. I watched her from the veranda while she walked the yard, her shoes light against the cracked tile. She met my gaze and said, "We can make it easy for you, old man. It was easy for you to ruin people once," I replied. "I don't want your ease." She left empty-handed. People underestimate the resolve of those who have nothing to lose. They mistake desperation for weakness. The court hearings began. I expected long. Dull session, more coffee than drummer banged of reluctance to foreclose was a public fact, and Mira was able to show how the shell companies and circular payments effectively kept Rakesh's liabilities off the books. Once the judge saw the chain of transactions, he ordered an independent audit. The bank protested, then delayed, then finally complied when the audit threatened reputational harm. Auditors have the terrible habit of being precise. They followed signatures, traced money through accounts, and found irregularities that were too big to be shrugged away. Word spread beyond our town. A regional journalist, Priyanka from the State Daily, came to interview me. She arrived with a recorder and a skeptical smile, expecting a typical slumdog versus rich man story. What she found instead was a careful, measured man who kept his anger in a drawer and only took it out to sharpen paper. "Why are you doing this?" "Je asked for Sushila. C'est simple. And for anyone else who thinks the system is a blanket for the powerful." Her article hit the next morning. Asterisk local retiree takes on bank, buys back power. Asterisk it was read by more than our usual readers. Someone forwarded it to a city editor who liked David and Goliath narratives. The story attracted attention the Vermes did not want. A local NGO reached out offering legal support to small-time creditors, filed protests against the bank's handling of collateral. And a retired auditor contacted Mira with a tip about forged signatures. The net tightened. Rakesh began to make more desperate moves. He started to sue the bank for alleged mismanagement, a counterattack intended to keep resources tied up in court. He contacted old cronies who threatened they laborers a few empty promises of lost work if they did not stop supporting me. I confronted one of the men who had been approached, a young contractor named BJ, and he was ashamed. I was afraid, he confessed. They have a way of ruining men quietly. You should have been afraid when they laughed at me, I replied. Now be afraid, for your silence. Fear can be unmade by common. Cause, we organized a small meeting in the village square with the workers and a few sympathetic shopkeepers. Mira spoke about rights and the rule of law. Priyanka promised more coverage if anything untoward happened. We agreed that any threats would be reported, that we wouldn't be bullied into silence. It's surprising what a group of ordinary people can do when they choose not to be ordinary anymore. One week, late at night, a tow truck tried to take the estate's newly fixed tractor. The men who came were rough, their voices low. They expected the workers to step aside. Instead, 50 villagers worth of people stood in the road, their silhouettes dense under the sodium lights. The tow driver hesitated. We have orders, he said, from the bank. Orders from whom? Shouted an old woman, Mrs. Desari, whose son had worked here for 10 years. From men who have lost their decency. The men backed down. The tow truck left, its engine whining like a wounded animal. Someone in the crowd started to clap, awkward and human, and the sound spread until it felt like a small victory. That night, I sat on the veranda and watched the moon slice the mango leaves into silver. A boy from the village handed me a cup of tea and said, "We're with you." I felt, for the first time since Sushila's funeral, that the presence of others could be a salve. The audit report came back clean against the bank. It concluded there were irregularities in how loans were documented and warned of negligence in oversight. The bank, eager to avoid litigation and public scandal, negotiated a settlement and accelerated foreclosure process against the shell companies, allowing creditors to call in collateral that led to the re-auctioning of properties that still bore Rakesh's name. The irony was thin as tissue. The very machinery Rakesh used to shuffle wealth now turned against what he had left. Rakesh, stripped of his bluff and his best suits, filed for bankruptcy. It came to the estate once more, hands wrung, voice small. "Sharmaji," he said, "please, I'll sign anything. Help me." I remembered the ice clinking in his glass, his laughter sharp as a knife. I remembered how he'd told me to read the fine print. "Help," I said. "I assent the same as pardon." He left, broken in a way that money can't mend. People thought the story would end their revenge delivered, balance restored. But I found, in the weeks after, that land is stubbornly neutral. It doesn't celebrate victories or mourn defeats. It only needs tending. I began to plant mango, saplings first, then rows of millet, and a small patch of vegetables for the workers' families. I set up a small clinic in the old guest room with the help of the NGO and hired a nurse from the town. We started a tiny pension fund for the labourers, collected from a small levy on the produce sold in the market. It wasn't much, but it was a promise kept. At night, staring at the ceiling, sometimes I heard laughter. In the far distance, the residue of old ghosts, but it no longer had power over me. The fields needed me, and in tending them I found a strange peace. I had not become the man I once was. I had become someone made by loss and by the slow, stubborn work of giving back what had been taken. The scales had been balanced, yes, but what mattered more was the way the community had learned to stand together. And the way a small act of persistence had exposed the rot beneath a gilded surface. There were consequences, loneliness, paperwork that never ended, the occasional legal threat, but I slept better than I had in years. Sushila's picture sat on a shelf in the office, and sometimes I spoke to her aloud, telling her about the mango trees and the men who finally got paid on time. "You were right," I said once, whispering into the dark. "Darkness can be met with light." She would have smiled and said, and with a good cup of tea, the village noticed, and they began to notice each other. The net of small kindnesses grew tighter and more robust than any of Rakesh's contracts. I had set out to reclaim what was mine, but in doing so I reclaimed something larger, trust. And as the monsoon returned, washing the red earth into soft mud that cradled the saplings, I felt the work was only beginning. The monsoon came like a confession that year loud, relentless and cleansing. The first downpour flooded the courtyard, and I watched from the veranda as rivulets carved new paths through the earth, carrying away what remained of old footprints. For a moment, I thought what how a real land. Maybe revenge, too, was just another kind of rain destructive at first, but eventually it made things grow. The estate had changed by then. Where weeds and arrogance had once ruled, rows of green pushed through mud. The workers, my people, as the villagers now called them, moved with purpose. The smell of wet soil and burning wood filled the air, mixing with laughter that wasn't cruel anymore. Children ran barefoot through puddles, chasing dragonflies, and I found myself smiling at the noise. It had been a long time since I'd smiled without bitterness attached, but even peace has a way of testing you. It began with a letter. Hand-delivered, unmarked envelope, sealed in red wax. Inside was a single sheet of paper stamped by the District Land Commission. The estate was being reviewed for historical claim verification. I knew immediately whose shadow lingered behind those words. Rakish was finished in business, but not broken enough to disappear. He still had a cousin in the revenue department, a snake in an old file room with access to the kind of forgotten documents that could make trouble for anyone. The letter was a warning, shot wrapped in bureaucracy. If they could prove even a small technical irregularity in the property transfers, they could freeze my holdings. Mira wasn't surprised when I showed her the notice. He's desperate, she said, flipping through the papers. But we'll need to get ahead of this. If he can't win in court, he'll try through corruption, and if the commission isn't clean, I asked. She gave a small, humorless laugh. Then we make it clean. Over the next few weeks, I found myself at Basemount Archives, the rustle of government files, the quiet menace of civil servants who spoke in riddles. I spent hours in the district office, tracing every scrap of ownership, from the earliest survey maps to modern records. What I discovered wasn't just the story of my land, it was the story of this entire region, generations of deceit layered like sediment. Every transaction stained by some forgotten betrayal. In one of the oldest registers, I found something extraordinary, a notarized note from 1946 Grand Fate, declaring that a portion of the estate's western boundary had been voluntarily ceded to the village panchayat as community farmland. The land had never been transferred officially. The Vermers had quietly absorbed it back into their estate decades later. I sat in that archive room, the paper trembling in my hand, and felt a strange clarity. They had built their empire on theft, and I had inherited their ghosts. If I brought this to light, it wouldn't just defend my ownership, it would expose their entire legacy as a fraud. Are you sure you want to use this? Mira asked when I showed her the document. This could just left them completely blow. I said, I'm just showing the Mira. We filed the discovery with the commission and attached an affidavit asserting that part of the land should be rightfully restored to the village. It was a calculated risk. By offering up a portion of the estate for public good, we took away their leverage. The commission couldn't accuse me of hoarding illegally obtained land if I was the one uncovering it stolen. History. Word spread fast. The villagers gathered near. Did your laughter make you rich, or just cruel? Look at the way, no, I said. You made choices. The rain drummed between us. He stared at the fields, at the workers, at the growing saplings, and for the first time, I saw something almost human flicker in his eyes. You turned this place into something good, he said quietly. I couldn't have done that, because you never cared to, I answered. He nodded, the smallest gesture of surrender I'd ever seen. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe you were meant to have it. He turned to leave, and then paused. Do you ever think of what you lost? Your wife, your peace. Was it worth it? I hesitated. The answer wasn't simple. Sushila's face came to me, her eyes soft and knowing. Nothing brings her back, I said. But she'd have wanted justice, not silence. He gave a faint, broken smile. Then you've found what I never did. He walked away into the rain, his figure shrinking into the mist. I didn't call after him. Some men are intimate. Montpas said the fire saplings grew. The commission closed its case, acknowledging the legitimacy of my ownership and approving the transfer of the community land. The estate was finally clean in record and in spirit. One morning, Priyanka returned to visit, camera slung over her shoulder. They're calling you the pension man now, she said with a grin. A folk hero for bureaucratic revenge. I'm no hero, I said, pouring her tea. Just a man who refused to vanish quietly. She looked around. The courtyard, now alive with workers in green shoots. Still, it's quite a sight. From lost pension to landowner, from laughter to legend, I laughed a real, quiet laugh. Legends are for fools. I'm just tending what was broken. But that night, alone under the stars, I couldn't help but wonder if perhaps every broken man who fights back becomes a legend in someone else's story. The wind rustled through the mango trees, carrying the scent of rain and earth and redemption. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark, "We did it, Sushila." We got it all back, not the money, but the dignity. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like applause. When the rains finally ceased, the land glistened under a newborn sun. The field shimmered like a vast mirror, reflecting everything that had been lost and found. The estate once a monument, too. Greed had become a living testament to endurance. The villagers called it Naibumi, the land of justice. I never asked them to, but when I heard the name whispered in the markets and at the temple steps, something deep within me softened. Every morning, I rose before dawn. The air smelled of dew and fertile earth, the kind of air that feels like forgiveness. The workers would arrive soon after, their chatter filling the silence like birdsong. I would sit on the veranda with my tea, watching the horizon blush pink. And for the first time in years, I felt no rush to be anywhere, no anxiety clawing at my chest. Peace wasn't a thunderclap. It was a slow dawn, patient and quiet. Then one morning, a visitor arrived, an unexpected one. She introduced herself simply. "I'm Kavya, your wife's niece. It took me a moment to place her." The last time I had seen her, she was a teenager, running through our house with a school bag twice her size. Now, she stood there in a crisp white kurta, her hair tied back, her eyes steady and intelligent. "I heard what you've done," she said, glancing around the estate. "I wanted to see it for myself." I gestured for her to sit. "You came all this way just for that?" She smiled faintly. "And to give you this," she handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a photograph of Sushila, sitting in her garden, smiling at something unseen. I hadn't known this picture existed. "I found it in an old album," Kavya said softly. "She used to talk about this place all the time. Said you'd build something that mattered." The words hit me like a quiet revelation. I had spent so long trying to prove something to the world, to Rakesh, to the system that had swallowed my pension, but maybe, unknowingly, I had been building what she foresaw. Not revenge, not wealth, something that asterisk mattered. Asterisk, we walked through the fields together, Kavya asking questions, her curiosity sharp. "Do you ever think of leaving?" she asked at one point. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere." "You've fought your battle. Maybe it's time to rest." I smiled at her youth. "Rest isn't always sleep. Kavya, sometimes it's work done without anger." Tatasvovning joyed with families. We sat under the mango, trees strung with fairy lights that flickered against the dusk. Children laughed, old men told stories, and for once, my heart felt light enough to join in. But peace, I had learned, never lasts untested. 2 weeks later, a convoy of government vehicles pulled up at the estate. The villagers gathered in wary silence as uniformed officials stepped out. Leading them was a man I recognized immediately, Deputy Commissioner Rajat Kapoor, a polished bureaucrat with the charm of a snake and the ethics of a thief. He had once been Rakesh's golf partner. "Mr. Sharma," he said smoothly, removing his sunglasses. "You've built quite an empire here." "Not an empire," I corrected. "A home," he smiled. "Semantics. We're here for a standard land evaluation, new zoning laws." "You understand?" Of course, I did. It was never standard. When the powerful can't destroy you with corruption, they use law. As his team surveyed the land, I noticed them taking photographs of areas far beyond the estate boundary, villagers' homes, community farmland. I confronted him quietly. "What are you really doing here?" "Due diligence," he smirked. "You've brought a lot of attention, Sharmaji. When small men make big noise, the system listens. Sometimes it listens too hard." His words were a warning wrapped in politeness. That night, Mira called. "They're setting you up," she said without preamble. "The district wants to declare the estate a commercial agricultural zone. Once that happens, they can lease portions of it to private developers companies linked to Kapoor's network." I laughed bitterly. Full circle. They lost it through greed, and now the system wants it back through greed again. Can you fight it? She asked. I can fight, I said. Winning is another matter. The next morning, I did something unexpected. I called for *Gram Siba * a full village assembly. By evening, nearly 200 people gathered beneath the banyan tree outside the estate. Faces young and old, men and women, all who had worked this land stood together. I stepped forward and said, they're coming again. Not with laughter this time, but with paper and power. They want to take what we built. So, I'm not asking you to fight for me. I'm asking you to fight for yourselves. A murmur spread through the crowd. Then Vijay spoke up, his voice firm. You gave this land to the people. It belongs to all of us now. If they want to take it, they'll have to take us too. The crowd roared its agreement. The sound rolled through the fields like thunder. That night, for the first time since my wife's passing, I didn't feel alone. The following days were a blur of tension. The government tried to push through its proposal. Mira and I filed petitions, and Priyanka began reporting again, this time calling it * the second siege of Naya Bhumi. * public opinion turned fast. Letters poured in from across the state, from farmers, teachers, retirees, people who saw in our struggle a reflection of their own powerlessness. Under mounting pressure, the administration hesitated. Kapoor, cornered by exposure, withdrew the zoning order. He called me once, "Lata tonight has been Wenham. You can't keep this up forever, old man. One day, you'll die. Then what?" "Then," I said, "the land will remember who it belongs to." He hung up. And so the estate lived on untouched, unbought, unbroken. The rains came again the following year, heavier and kinder. The mango trees bore fruit for the first time, and we held a harvest festival under their shade. Children danced barefoot. In the mud, the air thick with the smell of roasted corn and jasmine. As the drums echoed across the valley, I sat quietly at the edge of the crowd. Kavya found me there, smiling. "It feels like she's here," she said. "She is," I replied, looking at the trees swaying under lantern light. In every seed that survived, I closed my eyes and listened to the laughter that no longer hurt, to the hum of a world, finally in balance. I had been mocked, broken, forgotten. But I had built something eternal, not through vengeance, but through persistence. Somewhere beyond the noise, I heard Sushila's voice again, soft and steady. The way it used to be when she read to me at night. Justice isn't loud. Hurry, it's the silence that follows. When the truth finally stands on its own, the music swelled, and I whispered into the wind, "Yes, my love." The land remembers, and beneath the monsoon sky, Naya Bhumi breathed alive, forgiving and free. A year passed, then another. Seasons folded into one another, like pages of a book I no longer rushed to finish. Naya Bhumi had become a rhythm of its own, fields that whispered. In the wind, mango trees that bent under fruit, the laughter of workers echoing through the dusk. The scars of fire and betrayal had long been overtaken by green. Each morning I walked the boundary walls, touching the stone as I went, a habit that had become prayer. The land answered back in small ways, a sprout where none had grown before, a bird nesting under. The eaves, a child's chalk drawing on the old gate. Life insisted on returning. Kavya stayed. What began as a visit became purpose. She left her city job, moved into the caretaker's cottage, and started teaching literacy classes to the workers' children under the banyan tree. She called it Susila Pathshala. Watching her write the name on a wooden board made something inside me unclench. She'd be proud, I told her. She'd tell us to paint it blue. Kavya laughed. Blue brings peace, so we painted the sign blue. And on the day the little school opened, I planted another tree beside it, a neem sapling this time. For shade, I said. And memory, but peace, I'd learned, is not a static thing. It must be maintained, like soil. It requires attention. One morning, Mira arrived unexpectedly, files tucked under her arm, her eyes shining with that dangerous mix of excitement and worry. "You need to see this," she said, spreading papers across my desk. The papers were government drafts proposals for a new industrial corridor. A highway and logistics park were planned not far from our district. The map showed dotted lines cutting through the outer edge of Naya Bhumi. I stared at the red ink snaking across the survey plan. They said this land was safe. I murmured. It was. Until the state changed hands, Mira replied, "New ministers, new money." They see open fields and think profit. Kavya, who had joined us, clenched her fists. "We can't let them destroy this." Mira nodded. "You still have time. The public hearing is in 2 months. After that, they'll start compulsory acquisition. 2 months. I had faced down bureaucrats, banks, and the Vamas themselves, but this was larger, an entire machine that fed on quiet compliance. That night, I walked alone through the fields. The moon was high, the soil damp under my feet. I thought of the men and women who worked here, of their families who had built homes on its edges. If this land fell, it wouldn't just be mine. That was lost, it would be everyone's. The next day, I began to write. Not petitions this time, but letters to journalists, activists, retired colleagues, teachers. I wrote of what this land had become, of how it had turned grief into community. Kavya filmed short videos of the fields, of the schoolchildren reciting poems under the trees, and posted them online. She called it #Voices of NYA, YBHUMI. It spread faster than we expected. Within weeks, students from the city arrived to volunteer. Environmental groups sent statements of support. And an old friend from the railways contacted me offering data about how the proposed highway would cut through aquifers feeding nearby villages. The movement grew roots of its own. Wednesday of the hearing came, the town hall was packed. Rows of villagers, farmers, and workers filled the benches. I sat in the front row beside Mira, holding the original 1956 deed, the same document that had once saved the estate. The officials looked uncomfortable. The panel chairman cleared his throat. "We appreciate the sentiments," he began, "but development must move forward." I stood. "Development without conscience is destruction," I said, my voice steady. "You call this barren land. But look closer, it feeds families, it teaches children, it heals what greed once poisoned. If you pave it, you don't build a future. You erase one." A murmur ran through the hall. Mira handed over the reports, ecological surveys, groundwater maps, testimonies from villages. Priyanka, who had come to cover the event, filmed everything. When the hearing ended, the panel postponed its decision, an administrative way of saying they had been caught off guard. That evening, as we walked back to the estate, rain began to fall again. Kavya looked up and laughed. "It always rains when you fight for this place," she said. "Maybe the land likes to watch," I replied. Over the next few weeks, the story spread far beyond our district. National newspapers ran features. An environmental lawyer offered pro bono help. The government, facing public pressure, quietly redrew the corridor map. Nyebumi was spared once more. When the official notice arrived confirming it, the villagers held a festival. Not of victory, but of gratitude. Lanterns floated over the fields that night like small stars returning to earth. I sat apart from the crowd, watching the light drift upward. Kavya joined me, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders. "You did it again," she said. "No," I murmured. "We did. The land did." She smiled. "Will you ever leave this place?" I looked at trees, Adzorov. Crops stretching into the darkness, at the laughter carrying through the wind. "When the earth forgets my name," I said. And not before, years later, when my hands began to tremble too much for writing. I taught Kavya how to manage the records, how to keep the ledgers clean, how to talk to the officials without letting them smell fear. She learned fast. The work has called her Shoti Malik, the young light that. It meant the story would continue without me. On my last evening walking the fields, the air was golden, heavy with the scent of ripening fruit. The children of the school ran past, laughing, their shadows long in the setting sun. I stopped under the neem tree by the blue signboard and touched its rough bark. The wind carried a faint whisper, the same voice I had heard so many times before. "You kept your promise. Hurry." I closed my eyes, smiled, and whispered back, "We all did, Sushila," when night finally fell. Nyebumi slept beneath a sky full of stars, its heartbeat steady and eternal. And though my story had begun with loss and laughter that cut deep, it ended herein. A quiet field where justice had learned to grow roots. By the time the monsoons came again, the seasons no longer felt like time passing. They felt like continuations of the same rhythm. The same pulse that had started beating the day I decided not to be silent. I had grown slower, Mi steps ove. The fields were shorter, my breath came shallower. But my mind was still sharp, honed by years of surviving. Among predators in bureaucratic suits, Kavya had taken over most of the work. She managed the ledgers, the meetings, even the small cooperative we had formed with neighboring villagers. Naye Bumi had become more than an estate, it was a movement now. Every family had a share in the produce, every child a place in the school. A trust had been formed in my name, though I insisted it include everyone's, the Naye Bumi Collective. It was not about ownership anymore. It was about continuity. But continuity, like justice, comes with its own ghosts. That year, an illness swept through the region, something viral and swift, spreading through water after a flood. Children fell sick first. The school shut down, and the laughter that usually filled the mornings was replaced by coughs and prayers. Kavya worked day and night with the nurse, rationing medicine, writing to the district hospital for aid that never came. I could see the worry wearing her down. Every night, she'd return with exhaustion, written across her face. "We'll lose them," she whispered one evening, her voice breaking. "We don't have enough antibiotics. The hospital won't send any. They say we're too far." I sat silently, watching the storm clouds build in the distance. There was something cruelly familiar about that helplessness. It was the same feeling I'd had years ago, when Sushila needed treatment we couldn't afford. The same rot that had cost her life was creeping back through red tape and neglect. The next morning, I called in an old favor. There were still people who remembered me from the railways, clerks, officers, accountants, the invisible machinery that made the country run. I told one of them what was happening. His name was Dutta, a man who owed me a debt from long ago, and he didn't hesitate. By nightfall, a truck arrived at the gate, medicines, water purifiers, and food supplies marked for internal distribution. Dutta had rerouted a shipment meant for a cancelled government program. "You didn't get this from me," his voice crackled through the phone. "I never do," I replied. The villagers gathered when the supplies arrived, their relief palpable. Kavya's eyes filled with tears as we unloaded the crates. "You always find a way," she said softly. "No," I said. "I just remember how it feels when no one does." For the next week, the land turned into a field hospital. The school became a ward, the temple courtyard a kitchen. Priyanka came again to cover the story, this time not as a journalist chasing headlines, but as a volunteer carrying crates of water. The air was thick with fear and hope in equal measure. By the end of the month, the sickness began to fade. The children returned to class, thinner but smiling. The wind smelled clean again. The fields had survived, bruised but breathing. One night, when the worst had passed, Kavya found me sitting on the veranda, staring at the stars. "You saved them," she said. I shook my head. "No has." "Land did. It refuses to give up," she smiled, settling beside me. "You sound like her. She used to say that, didn't she?" The land remembers. "Yes," she whispered. "And so do people." There was a long silence between us, comfortable and full. The kind that needed no words. Mans loverman wound some metal. Tekele dit. They wanted to honor me for transforming a once corrupt estate into a model of community, self-reliance. They sent letters, called, even sent an officer to invite me personally. I refused. "What will you tell them?" Kavya asked. "That justice doesn't wear medals," I said. "And that the only award I want is for this land to stay free." The officer seemed bewildered, as if no one had ever said no before. He left with a half-smile, promising to mention my sentiments in the report. I doubted he would. But that evening, when the sun dipped low and the fields turned gold, the villagers came to the gate, holding garlands of marigold. They draped them over my shoulders and cheered. A group of children sang a song they'd written, about rain, about soil, about a man who planted trees and turned grief into gardens. I didn't know how to respond. My eyes blurred, not with sadness, but something quieter. Gratitude, perhaps. Or disbelief that this life, this strange, winding, painful life, had led here. That night, as I sat alone under the banyan tree, I felt the air shift. The wind rustled through the leaves, soft as breath. And for the first time in years, I didn't hear Sushila's voice in the distance. I felt her presence beside me, calm and complete. "Is it enough now?" she seemed to ask. I smiled into the darkness. Yes, I whispered. It's enough. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The crickets sang, the night wrapped itself around me, and the land, our land, slept without fear. A few weeks later, my body finally began to fail me. Not in a dramatic way. No sudden collapse, no struggle, just the quiet slowing of everything. The workers noticed before I did. Caviar insisted on taking me to the hospital, but I refused. No sterile walls, I said. I want to breathe this air till the end, and so I stayed. One evening, the sky turned the same color as the marigolds that had once crowned me. The villagers gathered outside, their murmurs distant and warm. I could hear children laughing, someone singing softly. Caviar held my hand. The fields are ready for harvest, she said, smiling through tears. So am I whispered. My eyes drifted past her to the horizon, the same one I'd watched so many mornings, waiting for something to change. Only now I realized it had changed, because we all had. As the last light faded, I thought of that first cruel laughter, of Rakesh's glass clinking, of the humiliation that had started it all. And for a fleeting moment, I almost felt grateful, because without that cruelty, none of this would exist. The land, the people, the peace. I took one last breath, heavy with the scent of rain and mango blossoms, and said, Sushila. We kept our promise, and then I was gone, quietly, like dusk giving way to night. They buried me under the neem tree beside the school, where the children's laughter never ceased. Caviar built a small stone marker that read simply, **Hari Sharma, the man who planted justice. *** every year, on the day of the first rain, they gather there to plant something new. To remember what was built not from power, but from patience. And when the wind moves through Naebumi, whispering through leaves and soil, it carries the same words I once spoke to the land, words that have long outlived me. ***, you laughed at my lost pension, but I sold your land. And then I gave it back to the world. ***, years passed after Hari Sharma's death. And yet his presence lingered in every grain of soil at Naebumi. The land did not mourn him. In silence it lived him. Each rustling leaf, each murmur of wind across the mango fields was a syllable of his name. And those who had once labored under his care carried his story, like scripture, retelling it to their children until it became part of the valley's pulse. Caviar had aged too, though time touched her more gently than it had touched him. She now sat where he once did on the veranda, at dawn. A cup of tea warming her palms, the horizon stretched wide and golden. The school had grown into a proper building, painted a deep blue that shimmered like a river under sunlight. The name played Sushila Pachala Asimu on the hill. ** every morning, children's voices rose in unison. ** Naebumi.